I shouldn't have said his real name. But the moment the word left my lips, I knew something irreversible had just begun. 10 minutes earlier, I was just Emily Carter, a waitress balancing a tray of overpriced cocktails in a Manhattan restaurant where the lights were too soft and the people were too powerful. The kind of place where a single dinner bill could cover my rent for 3 months and no one ever looked twice at the girl refilling their water. And that was exactly how I liked it. Invisible, unnoticed, safe, until the doors opened and the entire room shifted without a single word being spoken. I didn't need to look to know someone important had arrived, because the air itself changed, heavier somehow, like a storm pressing against the windows. And when I finally glanced up, I saw him, tall, composed, dressed in a tailored black suit that fit like it had been made for him alone, his dark hair swept back, his presence pulling attention without asking for it, and people moved out of his way not because they were told to, but because something in them understood they should. Alessandro De Luca. I heard someone whisper behind the bar, the name passing like a quiet warning, and I told myself it didn't matter, that he was just another wealthy man in a city full of them. But then he spoke, low and controlled, a few words exchanged with the men beside him, and something in my chest tightened because I understood every syllable even though I shouldn't have. Not here. Not now. Not after all these years of pretending I didn't. Sicilian, not Italian. Not the kind you learn in school or pick up from movies, but something older, sharper, carrying meanings between the words, and I forced myself to keep moving, to smile, to pour drinks like nothing had changed, because reacting would be a mistake, and mistakes had consequences I couldn't afford. I told myself to focus on the tray in my hands, on the clink of glass, on the soft hum of conversations, anything but. The way his voice seemed to cut through everything else, and yet I could feel it. The pull of something I had buried deep, something that recognized him before my mind allowed it. And when I approached his table, I kept my eyes lowered, careful, controlled, just another server doing her job. But I could feel his attention shift, subtle but precise, like he was noticing details others missed, like he was reading something in the way I moved. And for a second, just a second, I thought about what would happen if he knew, if he realized that I understood every word he was saying, that I could follow the conversation he thought was hidden, and the thought alone made my pulse quicken. Water, one of the men said, barely glancing at me, and I nodded, stepping closer, the scent of expensive cologne and something darker filling the space between us. And that's when it happened, not loud, not dramatic, just a single phrase spoken under his breath, a name, not the one everyone used, not the one they whispered with respect, but another one, softer, older, the kind of name that didn't belong in this room. And my hand stilled for half a second too long, just enough, and his eyes lifted, meeting mine for the first time, sharp, assessing, and I knew in that instant that I had been noticed, not as a waitress, not as background, but as something else entirely, something he didn't understand yet but intended to. And I should have looked away, should have apologized, should have done anything except what I did next, but the word slipped out before I could stop it, quiet, almost a breath, Luca. And the moment froze around us as if the world itself had decided to listen. The name did not echo loudly, but it did not need to, because silence answered it for me as every sound in the room seemed to fold inward and disappear, and I felt it before I saw it, the shift in him, subtle but absolute, like something locked behind his eyes had just turned its attention fully toward me. And there was no pretending now, no stepping back into the safety of being invisible, because I had already crossed that line with a single word that should not have existed in this room, and definitely not in my voice. His fingers paused around the glass in his hand, not tightening, not loosening, just still, controlled, but different. And when he spoke again, it was not to his men, it was to me, even though he had not said my name yet, not out loud. What did you just say? His voice was calm, the kind of calm that made people listen closer instead of relaxing, and I forced my hand to keep moving, pouring water into the glass in front of him, as if nothing had happened, as if my heart was not beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I am sorry, sir, I said, keeping my tone even, American, neutral, harmless. Did you need anything else? It should have been enough. It always was enough, but not this time, because he did not look away, and the men at the table did not speak, and I could feel their attention like pressure against my skin, trying to understand what had just shifted without knowing how or why. Look at me, he said, and it was not loud, it was not forceful, but it was not a request either, and I hesitated for half a second before lifting my gaze to meet his, and that was my second mistake, because now there was no hiding what he was searching for in my face recognition memory, something deeper than curiosity, and I knew that look because I had seen it once before a long time ago in a different place under a different sky, when names actually meant something, and I swallowed the thought before it could fully form. "I think you misheard me," I said quietly, hoping the words would settle the moment, undo it, rewind it. But his expression did not change. If anything, it sharpened just slightly, like he had expected that answer and dismissed it before I even finished speaking. He leaned back in his chair, slow, deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine, and switched languages without warning, the words soft, precise, Sicilian, not for his men, not for the room, but directly for me. "You understand me." It was not phrased like a question, and my chest tightened because there it was, the test, the line drawn in a language almost no one here would catch. And for a second I considered denying it completely, letting the lie stand, building a wall strong enough to hold. But the problem with old languages is that they do not just live in your mind, they live in your reflexes, in the way your thoughts shape themselves before you can stop them, and mine betrayed me because I hesitated again just long enough for him to see it. And that was all he needed. His gaze flickered to my hands, then back to my eyes, tracking every small reaction like it mattered more than anything else in the room. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, switching back to English, now smoother, colder, controlled, and I felt the question settle into something heavier, because he was not asking about the word anymore. He was asking about the past, about something buried and dangerous, and I should have stepped back, should have apologized, should have walked away, but my feet stayed where they were, rooted in a moment that felt too familiar and not familiar enough all at once. "I do not know what you were talking about," I said, but the words felt thinner than before, like they were already falling apart before they reached him, and his jaw tightened just slightly, the only visible crack in the perfect control he carried. "Say it again," he said quietly, and this time there was something under it, not anger, not yet, but something close to it, something that made the air feel smaller, harder to breathe. And I knew I should not. I knew every instinct I had built over years was telling me to stop, to disappear, to survive, but instead I leaned in just enough that only he could hear me, and I let the truth slip through one more time, softer this time, almost a whisper, "Luca Romano." And this time I did not look away for a moment. I thought the world might shatter under the weight of that name, but it did not. It only narrowed down to the space between us, to the quiet sound of his breathing, to the faint reflection of light in his eyes that had gone completely still. And that was when I realized something far more dangerous than anger had taken its place. Recognition, not fully formed, not yet understood, but alive and searching, and it made my pulse slow instead of race, because fear I knew how to handle, but this was something else entirely. One of the men at the table shifted in his seat like he was about to speak, but Alessandro lifted a single finger without looking at him, and the movement alone was enough to silence the entire table again, and I understood then that whatever happened next would not be shared, not with them, not with anyone else in this room. "Everyone leave us," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, the kind of tone that did not need to be repeated, and I felt it ripple outward through the space, as chairs moved quietly, as footsteps retreated, as conversations carefully avoided looking too closely at what was unfolding in front of them, because people like him were not questioned, they were worked around, and within seconds the table was empty except for him, and me standing there with a tray that suddenly felt too heavy in my hands and nowhere left to hide. "You should not know that name," he said after a moment, his gaze still locked onto mine, and I noticed the smallest shift in his posture, not relaxed, not tense, just focused, like every detail about me had become something he needed to understand, and I placed the tray down slowly on the edge of the table, needing my hands free, needing something to steady myself, even if I did not show it. "There are a lot of names in this city," I replied, keeping my voice even, careful not to let anything slip through that I could not take back. But he did not react to the deflection, not outwardly at least. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table, his eyes never leaving mine. "Not that one," he said quietly, and there it was again, that undercurrent of something deeper than suspicion, something tied to memory, to a version of himself that clearly did not belong to the man sitting in front of me now, and I felt the weight of it press against my chest, because I knew exactly what that name carried, even if I had spent years pretending I did not. "Where did you hear it?" he asked, and this time it was not just a question, it was a line drawn, one that would not be ignored or softened, and I hesitated not, because I did not have an answer, but because I had too many and none of them were safe, not for me and definitely not for him. A long time ago, I said finally, and watched as something in his expression shifted again, not softer, not kinder, but sharper like the edges of a puzzle piece finally beginning to form a shape he could recognize. That is not an answer, he replied, and his voice dropped just slightly enough to make the words feel closer, more personal, and I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding, because I could feel it now, the past moving closer, pressing against the present, refusing to stay buried any longer. You were not supposed to be here, I said before I could stop myself, and the words landed heavier than anything I had said before, because they were not just information, they were a warning, and for the first time since this started, he looked at me not like a stranger, not like a problem to solve, but like something impossible standing in front of him. Who are you? He asked, and there was no control in the question this time, no careful calculation, just something raw and uncertain, and I met his gaze without looking away, because there was no point in pretending anymore, not after everything that had already been said, not after the name that had changed everything. That depends, I answered quietly. Do you remember the girl who used to follow you around the old house near the coast? And the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of something breaking open between us, something that had been waiting for years to be seen, and finally, was the question, did not fade, it stayed between us, heavy and sharp, and I watched it land in his eyes like something striking glass from the inside, because this was not a detail someone could guess, not a story someone could invent. It was too specific, too quiet, too far removed from the world he lived in now, and for the first time since I had spoken his real name, Alessandro De Luca did not look like the man everyone feared. He looked like someone searching through years of silence, trying to find a memory he had buried on purpose. His gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but through me, like he was no longer seeing the restaurant, the table, the city outside the windows, but something older, something sunlit and distant. That house is gone, he said slowly, and there was something different in his voice now, not softer, not weaker, but less controlled, like he was choosing each word instead of letting them come naturally, and I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest, because that was not a denial, it was recognition. Most things are, I replied, keeping my tone steady, even as the past pressed closer in my mind, the sound of waves against stone, the smell of salt in the air, the way the wind used to carry voices across the courtyard in the late afternoon, when everything felt endless and safe in a way that no place in this city ever could be again. You used to sit on the back steps, I continued before I could stop myself, because once the memory started, it did not ask permission. You said it was the only place no one could hear you when you practiced speaking English. His jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to disbelief, and I saw it then, the moment the memory connected, not fully, not clearly, but enough to shift something fundamental in the way he was looking at me now, like I was no longer just a question but an answer he had not expected to find. That is not possible, he said, but the words lacked conviction, and I almost smiled, because I knew that tone. I remembered it from years ago, when he used to argue about things he already knew were true, but did not want to accept. You had a notebook, I said quietly, my voice dropping without thinking, because this part felt fragile, like saying it too loudly might break it. Blue cover worn at the edges. You kept writing the same sentence over and over until it sounded right. I could see it in his eyes now, clearer, the way his focus sharpened, not outward, but inward, piecing together details that had not mattered to anyone else, but had meant something once to him, and only him. You told me not to tell anyone, I added, and this time I did let a small breath escape, because that memory had never left me, no matter how much time had passed. You said names were important, and that some of them were not meant to be spoken outside certain walls. The silence stretched again, but it was no longer empty, it was full of recognition, building slowly, like something waking up after a long sleep. And when he spoke again, it was quieter than before, not because he was trying to control it, but because he was not entirely sure what he was saying anymore. That girl, he said the words almost to himself, she was not supposed to stay. And there it was, the final piece, the truth hidden inside something simple, and I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from something older, something that had never fully faded. I did not, I said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I was sent away the same night. Everything changed, and I saw it then clearly, the moment it all came back to him, not in fragments, not in doubt, but in certainty. His posture stilled, his eyes locked onto mine in a way that made the rest of the room disappear completely. No, he said quietly, shaking his head once like he was trying to reject what was already undeniable. She did not survive that night. And I held his gaze steady because this was the part that mattered, the part that could not be undone. You were told that, I replied softly, but you never saw what happened after. His denial did not come with force, it came with certainty, the kind that had been repeated enough times to become truth in his world, and I could see how deeply it had settled there, how it had shaped the man sitting in front of me, because believing that someone had disappeared completely was easier than questioning what really happened after that night. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between past and present until he stood. Slowly, the movement deliberate, controlled, but carrying a weight that had not been there before, and I realized this was no longer about a waitress and a customer. This was something else entirely, something that had reached into both of our lives long before this city, long before this moment. Then explain it, he said, his voice low, but no longer distant now. It was closer, sharper, directed only at me, and I felt it land not as a threat, but as a demand for truth, one I had spent years avoiding. You disappeared, he continued, taking a step around the table, closing the distance between us just enough to make the air shift again. There were no records, no trace, no one who could tell me where you went or what happened after that night. His eyes searched mine, not for fear, not for weakness, but for something real, something that would confirm or deny everything he had just remembered. And I knew there was no simple answer to give him, no clean version of the story that would fit into the world he had built since then. I did not disappear, I said quietly, holding his gaze, because looking away now would have undone everything. I was taken somewhere else, given a different name, told to forget everything I knew about that place, about you, about who I used to be. The words came slower than I expected, like they had been waiting for this moment, but still did not want to be spoken out loud. And you listened, he said, not accusing, not judging, just stating it as fact. And I nodded once, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. I was a child, I replied, my voice steady, even as the memory pressed harder against my chest. I did what I had to do to survive. And for a long time, that meant believing the version of the story they gave me. I could see the calculation return to his expression, now not the cold distance from before, but something more focused, more personal, like he was placing every word I said into a structure he was building in real time. Who told you to forget? He asked, and this time there was no hesitation in the question, because now he understood that this was not coincidence, this was not chance, this was something planned, something controlled. And I let out a slow breath, because this was the part one had never said out loud, not even to myself, in a way that felt real. People who did not want the past to come back, I said carefully, because even now I did not know how much of that past still existed, how much of it was still watching, waiting for something like this to happen. People who knew what that name meant, and what would happen if anyone connected it to the wrong person at the wrong time. His jaw tightened again, but this time it was not disbelief, it was understanding, the kind that comes when pieces fall into place whether you want them to or not. And now you are here, he said, and I could hear the shift in his voice again, not just questioning, but something deeper, something that carried both warning and recognition. Working in a place like this, speaking a language you were supposed to forget, saying a name no one here should even know. He took another small step closer, not enough to intimidate, but enough to make the distance between us feel intentional. That is not an accident, Emily. And hearing my name from him for the first time sent a quiet ripple through me, because it confirmed what I already knew. He had been paying attention long before this conversation began. No, I admitted softly, it is not. And for a moment neither of us moved, because we both understood what that meant, that this meeting was not random, that something had been pulling us back toward this point, whether we realized it or not. Then tell me the truth, he said, and this time there was no distance left in his voice at all, just a quiet intensity that made it impossible to ignore. Why now? I held his gaze steady, feeling the weight of the answer settle into place, because this was the moment where everything changed, not just for him, but for me as well, because someone wanted you to hear it, I said finally, and they knew I was the only one who could say it and make you believe it was real. The words did not just land, they settled into something heavier than either of us could ignore, and I saw it in the way his expression shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else in the room would notice, but I was not anyone else. I knew what it looked like when something controlled started to fracture from the inside, because I had seen it once before in a boy who used to sit on stone steps staring at the ocean like it held answers no one else could give him, and now that same look was back, older, sharper, but unmistakable. Someone wanted me to hear it. He repeated slowly like he was testing the shape of the sentence, trying to decide if it fit into the world he understood, and when his eyes met mine again, there was no distance left in them, only focus, only intent. Who? The question came without hesitation, this time direct and immediate, and I felt the weight of it settle into my chest, because this was the part one could not answer, not completely, not safely. If I knew that I would not be standing here, I said quietly, and it was the truth, at least the part of it I could give him without unraveling everything else. I was told where to be and when, nothing more. He studied me for a long moment, not looking for a lie, but measuring the limits of what I was willing to say, and I could feel that pressure building again, not threatening, not yet, but close enough to make every word matter. You expect me to believe that someone arranged this? He asked, his tone controlled, but edged now, with something sharper, something that did not like uncertainty, and I held his gaze, because this was not about belief, it was about pattern, about the way events lined up too precisely to be ignored. You already do, I replied softly. You just have not decided what it means yet. That seemed to land deeper than anything else, because he went still again, not frozen, but thinking, calculating in a way that reached beyond the moment into everything surrounding it. And I realized then that he was not just replaying what had happened here, he was connecting it to something larger, something I could not see, but he clearly could. This place, he said after a second, his voice quieter, now more deliberate. You chose it. It was not a question, and I shook my head slightly because that part mattered more than he understood. No, I was placed here, I corrected, and I watched the subtle shift in his expression as that detail settled into place, because it changed everything. It meant someone had been watching, not just him, but me as well, long enough to position both of us exactly where we needed to be. How long? He asked, and I knew he was not asking about tonight anymore. He was asking about something far more dangerous. A few weeks. I answered honestly, long enough to know your routine. Long enough to know you would walk through that door tonight. I glanced briefly toward the entrance, then back to him, because even now part of me expected something to change, something to interrupt this moment before it went any further, but nothing did. The restaurant continued around us like normal, like this conversation was not quietly rewriting something neither of us fully understood yet. And you waited, he said, and there was something in his voice, now not suspicion, not exactly, but something closer to realization. You waited until the right moment to say it. I did not answer right away because the truth was not simple, it was not clean, it was not something I could explain without stepping into something I had spent years avoiding. I waited until you would hear it, I said finally, and his gaze sharpened again, because he understood the difference immediately. This was not about timing, this was about impact, about making sure the name did what it was supposed to do when it was spoken. You knew what it would do to me, he said quietly, and I could feel the shift again, not anger, not yet, but something deeper, something personal, and I did not look away because this was the part where everything had to be honest, even if it changed everything that came after. I knew it would make you remember, I said, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, because now there was no space left for denial, no distance left to hide behind, just the truth sitting between us, waiting to see what he would do with it. The truth did not explode, it settled slowly like dust after something unseen had shifted, and I watched it happen in real time, the way his eyes held mine. Not searching anymore, not questioning, but accepting something he had not expected to face tonight, and maybe had spent years avoiding without realizing it. And for a long second neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to test, no angle left to approach this from, without stepping fully into what it meant. Remembering changes things, he said finally, his voice quieter, now not in volume, but in weight, like every word carried something more than just sound, and I nodded slightly because that was the part no one ever talked about, the part where the past did not stay where you left it, it followed you forward, reshaping everything you thought you understood about who you had become. It always does, I replied, and for the first time since this started there was no need to guard the words, no need to hide behind something safer, because we had already crossed that line minutes ago, without realizing how far it would take us. His gaze shifted briefly, not away from me, but past me toward the entrance of the restaurant, like he was measuring the room in a way that had nothing to do with the present moment and everything to do with what might come next. And I felt it too, that quiet tension building. Again, not sharp, not immediate, but there, like a distant storm you could sense before you ever saw it. If someone wanted this, he said slowly, bringing his attention back to me, then this does not end here. It was not a question, and I felt the weight of it settle into place because I had known that from the beginning, even if I had not allowed myself to fully acknowledge it until now. No, I said softly, it does not. And the honesty of it seemed to land differently this time, not as information, but as confirmation that whatever had started tonight was not contained within these walls, not limited to a conversation or a memory, but something that would follow both of us long after this moment ended. Then you should not be here anymore, he said, and this time there was something unmistakable in his tone, not control, not distance, but concern, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but sits just beneath the surface, steady and real, and it caught me off guard more than anything else he had said, because it was not what I expected, not from the man people avoided, not from someone who had built his life on control and calculation. I have been here for weeks, I replied, keeping my voice, even though something in my chest shifted slightly at the way he said it. If something was going to happen, it would have already. He shook his head once, not dismissing me, but correcting something I could not yet see. Not until now, he said quietly, and I felt the difference immediately because he was right. Whatever had been set into motion had needed this moment, this recognition, this connection before it could move forward, and now that it had, there was no going back to before. You think I am in danger, I said, and it was not fear in my voice, just clarity, because I needed to understand exactly where he stood in this now that everything had changed. I think anyone who can make me remember something I was not supposed to is already part of something dangerous, he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just a simple statement of fact. And for a moment, the noise of the restaurant returned in small pieces, the clink of glass, distant voices, footsteps moving carefully around us, like the world was slowly remembering how to function again, even though nothing about this felt normal anymore. Then why are you still here? I asked, and this time I meant it, because if he understood the risk, if he saw the pattern, then staying made no sense unless there was something else driving him, something beyond logic, beyond caution. His eyes met mine again, steady, unwavering, and whatever distance had been there before was completely gone now, replaced by something far more direct. Because walking away would mean letting someone else decide how this ends, he said, and the certainty in his voice settled into something final, something that did not leave room for doubt. And I do not do that. I held his gaze for a moment longer, feeling the shift in everything around us, the quiet understanding that whatever had started tonight was no longer just about the past or the name or the memory. It was about what came next, and neither of us was stepping back from it anymore. The certainty in his voice did not leave space for argument. And for a moment, I almost forgot where we were, the quiet hum of the restaurant, the soft glow of the overhead lights, the illusion of normalcy that still surrounded us, like nothing had changed when everything had already shifted beyond recognition. And I realized then that this was the part where most people would step back, would choose distance, safety, denial, anything that allowed them to pretend the past was not reaching into the present. But neither of us moved, neither of us looked away, because we both understood something fundamental. This was never going to be something we could walk away from. Then you already know what comes next, I said quietly, and watched the way his expression adjusted, not surprised, not uncertain, just aware, like he had already started mapping out possibilities. The moment I said those words, someone is watching, he replied. And it was not a guess, not even a conclusion. It was an acceptance of something that had likely been true long before tonight. And I felt a small chill settle beneath the surface of my calm, because hearing it spoken out loud made it real in a way that thinking it never did. They would have to be, I admitted, glancing briefly toward the edges of the room, not searching, not obviously, just enough to acknowledge the possibility without drawing attention to it. Because if someone had orchestrated this, then they would not make it obvious. They would not risk losing control of whatever this was becoming. Not just watching you, he added, his voice lower, now more precise. Watching me too. And I understood immediately why that mattered more than anything else, because it meant this was not about me being placed here or him walking in at the right time. It was about both of us being positioned like pieces on a board neither of us could fully see yet. Then this is not about the past, I said slowly, feeling the thought form as I spoke it. It is about what we do with it now. He studied me for a moment longer, like he was weighing something deeper than the words themselves, like he was deciding whether I understood the full weight of what I had just said, and after a second he nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition. If someone wanted me to remember, he said, then they expect me to act on it. The implication settled heavily between us, because that meant whatever came next was not random, it was anticipated design shaped by someone who believed they could predict his response and use it for something beyond either of us. And you do not like being predictable, I said, and there was a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close to acknowledgement. No, he replied simply, and for a brief second the tension eased just enough to let something else surface, something that felt almost familiar in a way I had not expected after all this time. Good, I said softly, because that might be the only advantage we had left. Then do not do what they expect. The silence that followed was different from the others, not heavy, not uncertain, but focused like a decision forming, without needing to be spoken out loud. And when he moved, it was subtle, just a slight shift closer, not enough to draw attention, but enough to change the space between us again. Then I start by changing the pattern, he said, and there was something definitive in it now, something that did not leave room for hesitation. You do not leave alone tonight. I blinked, once caught off guard by the certainty in that statement, because it was not phrased as a suggestion or even a question. It was a decision already made, and for a moment I felt the instinct to resist, to step back into the independence I had built for myself over the years. But that instinct faded just as quickly as it appeared, because deep down I knew he was right. Whatever had started tonight had already changed the rules, and pretending otherwise would not make it safer. And what makes you think I would agree to that? I asked quietly, testing the boundary more out of habit than genuine resistance, and his gaze held mine steady, unwavering, like the answer had already been decided long before I asked the question. Because you already know you are not safe walking away from this alone, he said, and the truth in it did not feel like a threat. It felt like clarity, the kind that settles in without needing to be forced, and I let out a slow breath, realizing that this was the moment where choice became something else, something shaped by circumstances rather than preference. And when I met his eyes again, there was no hesitation left. Then we changed the pattern, I said, and the quiet understanding that followed did not need to be explained, because we both knew this was only the beginning of something neither of us had planned, but neither of us was willing to ignore anymore. The decision settled between us without needing to be repeated, and for the first time since this started, I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not uncertainty, but a quiet awareness that whatever came next would not be something I faced alone. And that changed everything more than I expected it to, because for years I had learned how to move through the world without leaving traces, without drawing attention, without depending on anyone. And now all of that felt less like strength and more like preparation for this exact moment. Then we do not leave together, he said suddenly, and I looked at him confused for half a second before he continued, his voice calm, precise, already adjusting the plan, as if this was something he had done 100 times before. We leave separately, but we do not separate. I understood immediately what he meant, the difference between appearance and reality, the way patterns could be broken without being obvious, and I nodded once, because it made sense, because it was smarter, because whoever was watching would be expecting something more direct, something easier to follow. You go first, he added, his gaze shifting briefly toward the entrance again, measuring timing, distance, variables I could not see, but trusted. He understood. Walk out like nothing has changed. Do not look back. Do not slow down. There was no hesitation in his instructions, no uncertainty, just quiet control, and I felt myself fall into the rhythm of it without resistance, because this was not about control anymore. It was about survival, about staying one step ahead of something neither of us fully understood yet. And you? I asked softly, even though I already knew the answer, and he met my gaze again, steady, grounded. I will follow at a distance, not close enough to connect us, not far enough to lose you. The simplicity of it made something inside me steady, because it meant we were already adapting, already refusing to follow the path someone else had laid out for us. Where do I go? I asked, and this time there was a slight pause, not uncertainty, but calculation, like he was choosing the next move carefully instead of reacting. There is a coffee shop 2 blocks south on Madison Avenue, he said finally. Open 24 hours, stay there, order something, sit where you can see the entrance. I nodded again, committing the details to memory, because this was no longer a suggestion, it was a plan, and I could feel the shift in myself, the way my focus sharpened, the way everything unnecessary fell away until there was only this moment and what came next. And if something changes, I said quietly, because I needed to know how far this plan extended, how much room there was for the unexpected, and his expression did not shift, but his voice did, just slightly, carrying something more personal beneath the control. then you trust your instincts the same way you did tonight. The words settled deeper than anything else he had said because they were not about the plan, they were about me, about what I had already done without realizing how much it mattered. And I held his gaze for a second longer before stepping back, creating just enough distance to make this look like nothing more than a conversation ending between a waitress and a customer. "Emily," he said, and hearing my name again stopped me just for a fraction of a second before I turned back to him. "Do not disappear again." It was not a command, it was not even a request, it was something else, something quieter, something that carried more weight than either of those things combined. And for a moment, I did not know how to answer, because that was not a promise I had ever planned to make to anyone, but something in his expression made it impossible to ignore. "I did not choose to the first time," I said softly, and that was the truth, the only truth I could give him right now, and it seemed to be enough because he nodded once, not pushing, not demanding more, just accepting it for what it was. And I turned then, picking up the empty tray as if this was just another shift, another table, another night, and I walked toward the exit without looking back, without slowing down, feeling every step like a line being drawn between who I had been and what I was stepping into now. And when I pushed open the door and felt the cool night air against my skin, I did not hesitate. I kept walking because I knew without needing to see it that he was already moving to, and somewhere between the restaurant and the quiet street beyond it became clear that this was never just about remembering. It was about what happens when the past refuses to stay where it belongs and chooses instead to follow you forward until you finally turn around and face it.